Hello everyone, this is Dullahan, your favorite storyteller. If you enjoy my stories, make sure to like and subscribe to help the channel. Comment below what stories you'd like to see next, and relax with today's stories. It was a regular night, warm and calm, and the ship felt like a floating palace. Golden chandeliers, smooth carpets, the works. We'd had a few drinks, maybe more than a few, when Mike brought up Deck 13. Said he'd heard about it from a guy in the bar. Apparently, the deck wasn't technically finished. Off limits, a dark spot way down by the hull, but big enough that he was sure they wouldn't lock it up for just any reason. We laughed it off at first, calling him a cheap thrill junkie, but curiosity got the best of us, or maybe just pride. Off limits was code for untouched, and untouched spots sounded like prime exploring territory after a few beers. So we egged each other on, giggling our way down empty corridors, trying not to make too much noise. I remember thinking that getting caught would be the worst that could happen. How wrong I was. The ship was huge, way bigger than it felt when we were in the bars or pool area. We ducked under ropes, ignored the odd sign, climbed down narrow staircases until everything was darker, and our voices started echoing off cold metal walls. It was like we'd gone from a luxury cruise into some industrial pit. The smell changed, too, stale and salty, like old water and something else I couldn't name. "Hey, Mike, I think they left Deck 13 down here for a reason," Jenny whispered, though her voice seemed swallowed by the walls. "Nah," he said, way too confident. "It's just closed for construction or something. Just wait till we're there. It'll be epic." But as we went lower, even Mike seemed quieter. I couldn't see his face in the shadows, but I felt his energy change. When we reached the heavy, dark doors leading into Deck 13, I could swear the air got colder, like the whole place had its own sick kind of heartbeat. I remember feeling my skin crawl, but I tried to shake it off. We were all nervous, nothing more. Or so I thought. We squeezed through the doors and onto the deck, which wasn't what I expected. No construction tools, no half-finished floors or walls, just this wide-open, empty space stretching out into darkness, like some giant cargo hold. Metal walls, half-rusted in spots, seemed to close in around us, and then we heard it. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. A soft splashing sound, far off, somewhere in the shadows. I froze, but no one else seemed to notice. I could have shrugged it off, too, but then came another sound. A faint whisper, like someone breathing out words they weren't sure they wanted to say. We exchanged glances, and Mike gave me a look like he was daring me to be the first one scared. So, I forced a laugh. "It's just water. Ship must have a leak or something, right?" But as we kept walking, that leak sounded closer, like water splashing from something moving, something creeping around in the dark where we couldn't see. My heart was pounding. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to be the one to say it. "Guys," Jenny finally whispered, "maybe we should—" Another sound cut her off. A faint scraping noise, metal against metal, coming from somewhere to our right. We turned, squinting, but all we could see was more shadow. My stomach felt twisted in knots, and I noticed that Jenny and Sam were starting to look as freaked out as I felt. "Let's keep going," Mike said, his voice low, though he didn't sound quite as cocky as before. So we kept moving, though my feet felt like lead. I started counting our steps, focusing on the rhythm to keep from thinking about the sounds or the way the shadows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking straight at them. And then, out of nowhere, we heard it. A splash, clear and loud, like someone plunging into water. "Did you hear that?" Sam asked, his voice barely a whisper. Nobody answered. We all froze, straining to hear, our breaths shallow and quick. A second later, we caught something moving. No, someone moving, at the edge of our vision. A pale, glistening shape, just standing there in the dark, almost hidden by the shadows. For a moment, I thought I was seeing things. I blinked, trying to clear my head, but when I opened my eyes, it was still there, still watching us. Then, just as quickly, it disappeared back into the darkness. "Come on," I stammered, grabbing Jenny's hand. "I think we've seen enough." Nobody argued this time. We turned, heading back the way we came. But with every step, it felt like the walls were getting narrower, the darkness creeping closer. The metal felt colder under my hand as I trailed it along the wall, just to make sure I knew the way out. And then, from somewhere close, so close it made my skin crawl, came that whisper again, soft, angry, and sad all at once, like it had been trapped in these walls forever. By then, my heart was beating so loud I thought it might echo, and all I wanted was to get back to the light, back to the rest of the ship. But the sounds followed us, lingering, getting closer, as if something was just a few steps behind. We tried to hurry, but the path back felt endless, like it kept stretching out. I don't know how to explain it, but everything was wrong down there. The walls, the air, the whole place. Even the lights barely reached, flickering just enough to tease shapes in the shadows. I didn't know where to look because every time I did, it felt like something was there, something just waiting for us to get closer. Then we heard a cry. It was Jenny. I turned, but she was gone. Just gone, like she'd vanished into the dark. "Jenny?" I shouted, my voice bouncing off the walls, sounding strange and hollow. We waited, breathless, staring into the shadows where she'd just been. But there was nothing. Just the emptiness, stretching out further than it should, like some twisted, dark maze. "Jenny!" Mike yelled, and took off running. We followed, though every nerve in my body was screaming at me to get out, to leave, and forget any of this had ever happened. We didn't get far before Sam stopped, his face pale as he stared down another corridor. I followed his gaze, and my blood went cold. There was Jenny, or something that looked like her, standing still with that same dripping, pale skin, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, just that awful whisper, the same one we'd heard before. And then she was gone, fading back into the dark. No, this isn't happening," Sam muttered, shaking his head, backing away. But before I could even try to get him to calm down, he took off in a sprint down another passage. I didn't want to leave him, but I couldn't bring myself to chase him either. There was no logic, no plan, just blind terror. "Stay close," I whispered to Mike, though my voice barely came out. He nodded, his face slack with fear, and we turned, ready to just find some kind of exit. But then we saw them. Figures, pale and dripping, started appearing along the walls, just on the edge of the flickering light. Silent, staring, watching us. They looked like people, but wrong somehow. Their skin was bloated, grayish, their hair hanging limp and wet. Clothes clung to their bodies in rags, like they'd been underwater for ages, left to rot. They didn't move, just stood there, watching, faces frozen in expressions of betrayal, of shock. And worse, I could tell that they were dead, long dead. I could see it in their eyes, empty and hollow, as though they had all been ripped away from their lives at once, trapped down here. What do they want?" Mike stammered, and I could see his whole body shaking. I had no answer for him. All I knew was that I didn't want to be next. We turned again, moving faster now, though every step felt like we were sinking deeper into some nightmare that wouldn't let go. The walls seemed to close in, shadows twisting around us. I kept expecting to feel a hand grab my shoulder, cold and wet, pulling me back. We passed more of them, standing like silent guards, some with arms outstretched, some with eyes fixed right on us, unblinking. I felt their gaze burn right through me, like they could see everything. All my fears, my regrets, things I didn't even want to admit to myself. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Run!" I shouted, and Mike bolted with me, our footsteps echoing too loudly, too close. Behind us, I heard splashing, faint but getting louder, like someone's were right on our heels. "Keep going, don't look back," I gasped, though I could barely keep myself from glancing over my shoulder. We were close to the doors, or at least I thought we were. But then Mike stumbled, his foot catching on something I couldn't see, and he went down with a grunt, his hands splayed on the damp floor. I reached out, trying to help him up, but then we both froze. I could feel it, the cold, wet touch on my arm, like fingers brushing my skin. And then they were there, all around us. Those dead, staring faces, closing in, their hands reaching out, pale and dripping, curling around Mike's ankle, his wrists. "No, please!" Mike screamed, kicking, thrashing. But it was useless. They were too strong, their cold hands dragging him backward, inch by inch, into the shadows. I wanted to help him, but my feet wouldn't move. I just stood there, rooted in place, frozen by fear. All I could do was watch as he disappeared, his face twisted in terror, those dead eyes still watching him, relentless and hollow. I backed away, too scared to scream, barely able to breathe. And then I ran. I don't even know how I found the strength, but my legs just moved, carrying me faster than I thought I could go, back through the twisted passages, ignoring the flickering shadows, the cold whispers, the splashing sounds that seemed to follow me no matter how fast I ran. Somehow, I reached the doors. I didn't stop to think, didn't even look back. I burst through them, slamming them shut behind me, and collapsed against the wall, panting, shivering. The sound stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. I don't know how long I sat there catching my breath, staring at those doors, afraid they might open again. Afraid that those empty eyes, those wet hands, would be waiting right on the other side. When I finally got up, I stumbled my way back to the upper decks, back to the lights, the warmth, the voices of the other passengers. I tried telling someone what happened, tried to make them understand, but they just looked at me like I was crazy. Maybe I was. But I know what I saw. I know what's waiting down there beneath Deck 13. And I swear, sometimes at night, when the ship is quiet, I can still hear the whispers, still feel those cold eyes watching. Get ready for the next story. If you haven't already, like and subscribe to continue listening to my stories, and enjoy. I don't even know where to begin. Maybe I should have seen it coming, but I didn't. All I wanted was a nice trip with my son, Ethan. It had been a rough year for us. He'd been through a lot, and I thought this cruise might help us reconnect. Just the two of us, out on the ocean, away from everything. We boarded the ship in the middle of the afternoon, and it was beautiful. Huge, gleaming white, like something out of a dream. I'd never been on a ship this big, and neither had Ethan. I kept telling him how lucky we were, how this was a once-in-a-lifetime chance, but he didn't seem to care much. He just stared out at the ocean with this weird look on his face. I thought maybe it was just the excitement getting to him, but looking back now, I'm not so sure. The first few days went by without anything strange. We did all the usual tourist stuff, ate at the buffet, explored the decks, took a million pictures. Ethan seemed happy enough, although he started spending more and more time near the edge of the ship, staring out into the water. I thought it was just him being a kid. He's always had a thing for the ocean. But it started to feel odd, like he was waiting for something. Then it happened. One night, after we had dinner, Ethan told me about his friend. I'd just tucked him into bed, and he looked up at me with those big eyes, all serious. "Daddy," he said, voice low, "there's a boy out there." I figured he was just tired, maybe imagining things, so I brushed it off. "A boy? What are you talking about?" He stared at me like I wasn't getting it. "The boy in the waves, he's always there when I look out at the water. He wants me to come play." I laughed it off, thinking it was some kind of childhood fantasy. "Ethan, there's no boy in the waves, it's just your imagination." But he shook his head like he didn't believe me. "No, Daddy, he's real. He's wet, like he's been in the water, and he's calling to me." I didn't know what to say to that. I just ruffled his hair and told him it was time for sleep, that maybe he was just tired. But when I went to leave the room, I caught him staring out the window, his face pressed against the glass, like he was looking for something. I went back to the deck, trying to forget about it. The ship was huge, and the sounds of the water lapping against the hull were soothing, almost calming. But something didn't sit right with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan's friend wasn't just some fantasy. I decided to keep an eye on him over the next few days. Nothing too obvious, just casual stuff, like asking him if he wanted to play or trying to talk about the boy he'd seen. But Ethan didn't want to talk about it anymore. He kept looking out at the ocean, like he was waiting for something. And then I noticed other kids, small kids, some even younger than Ethan, starting to act the same way. Their parents would be on the deck, chatting or enjoying their drinks, and the kids would be staring out into the water, looking like they were waiting for something too. At first, I thought it was just me. I mean, how could all these kids be seeing the same thing? But then, one evening, I overheard two parents talking about it. One of them, a woman, was asking another, "Has your son been talking about a boy in the waves?" The other woman nodded, looking uncomfortable. "Yeah, and it's not just him. A few others have mentioned it too. But they're all saying the same thing. This boy, wet, pale, calling them to the edge of the ship." I froze. I had to turn away before they saw me, but I couldn't stop shaking. Was it possible? Was there something in the water? Or was it just some weird coincidence? Later that night, Ethan told me again. He'd been acting strange all day, quiet, distant, not really himself. But when I tucked him in, he was back to that serious look. "Daddy," he whispered, "the boy's calling me again. He says I should come play." I didn't know what to say. I told him to stay in bed, to stay safe. But that night, I stayed up longer than usual, watching the ocean from the balcony. I don't know what I was hoping for, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I was about to go back inside when I saw something out there, just for a split second. A figure moving in the water, just below the surface. It was pale, wet, and seemed to be watching the ship. I told myself it was a trick of the light, the water, or the moon. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. And that's when the sinking feeling hit me. Something was out there. Something was calling to the kids, and I couldn't let Ethan go near the railing again. The next day, I tried to talk to Ethan about it again, but he was distant. He wouldn't look me in the eye when I asked him about the boy. The whole thing just felt wrong. That night, we had dinner, and I could tell something was off. Ethan didn't eat much, barely touched his plate. He kept looking out the windows, eyes fixed on the dark water. I kept telling him to focus on his food, but he didn't respond. I felt this knot forming in my stomach, but I couldn't figure out what it meant. He was just a kid, right? It's normal for them to have odd thoughts and dreams, isn't it? But then, after we went back to the cabin, he did something I didn't expect. I was brushing my teeth when I heard it, the creak of the door opening. I froze. "Ethan," I called, rushing out into the hallway. I didn't know why I was so panicked, but something deep in me felt like something terrible was happening. I rushed to his room. The door was cracked open and I could see the dim light of the hallway reflecting off his face, but Ethan wasn't in his bed. He wasn't anywhere in the room. My heart raced. I bolted to the balcony, and there he was. He was standing by the railing, staring out at the water. His hands rested on the edge, fingers curled like he was holding on to something. His face was pale, almost ghostly in the low light. "Ethan!" I screamed, my voice cracking as I ran toward him, but he didn't move. He didn't even blink. I reached him just as the ship shifted with the waves, a loud groan that made my heart stop. I grabbed his arm, yanking him away from the railing. He looked at me like I'd just woken him from a dream. "Daddy, the boy wants me to come play," he whispered, his voice almost too soft to hear. I could barely breathe. I shook my head, trying to force the words out of my mouth, but they wouldn't come. I was scared. So scared. I pulled him away from the edge, almost dragging him back into the cabin, my hands trembling as I locked the door behind us. But when I looked at him, Ethan wasn't the same. His eyes were glazed over, distant, like he wasn't really there anymore. I sat with him for hours, watching the door. I couldn't sleep, not with the feeling that something was lurking outside. I kept hearing the ocean crashing against the ship, each wave like it was calling to me. Or worse, calling to Ethan. The next day, I tried to talk to the crew about it. I even spoke to a few parents, but nobody seemed to care. Some of the other kids were starting to act weird, sure, but it was all shrugged off. I felt like I was going crazy. How could no one else see it? The pull of the water, the way it called to the kids like it had some kind of power over them. When I was on deck that afternoon, I overheard two crew members talking. One was saying something about children going missing on past cruises. Nothing official, but just enough for me to catch it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong from the start. It wasn't just the ocean. It was something out there in the water, and it was calling to my son. That night, I didn't leave Ethan's side. I stayed in his room, watching him closely, making sure he didn't slip away again. But no matter how hard I tried to keep him safe, it felt like I was losing control. I couldn't protect him from whatever was pulling him toward the edge of the ship. Then, the worst happened. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of Ethan's voice. Soft, faint, almost like a whisper. I jumped out of bed, rushing to the balcony before I even knew what I was doing. And there he was again. Ethan stood at the railing, his back turned to me, staring into the black ocean like he was hypnotized. The water below him seemed to move differently, almost like it was alive. And there, in the moonlight, I saw it. A pale figure in the water, rising up from the waves. A child, the wave boy. It grinned, its teeth white against the dark sea, and it motioned with one hand, as if telling Ethan to come closer. My blood ran cold. "Ethan!" I screamed, rushing toward him, my voice breaking. "No, you can't. Don't listen to him. He's not real." But Ethan didn't move. He didn't even look at me. His hand reached out as if he was going to grab the boy in the waves, as if he was going to let go. I lunged forward, yanking Ethan away from the railing with all my strength. But that's when I saw it. His face. His eyes were vacant, almost empty, like the light in him had been swallowed up by the sea. The wave boy grinned wider, showing too many teeth. It was almost mocking me. It tilted its head and motioned again, as if daring me to let go of Ethan's hand. I couldn't breathe. The ocean roared behind me, louder and louder, like it was calling to us, trying to drag us both in. I pulled Ethan back, harder this time, yanking him away from the edge with a desperation I didn't know I had in me. I don't even know how I got back to the cabin. I just remember holding him, shaking. Ethan finally started to cry, real, terrified sobs, but I could hear the water still calling, whispering. I could feel its pull, like it was reaching for us, wanting us to come back. I locked the door again. I sat by the window, staring at the dark ocean, and I knew we weren't safe. Not while that thing, whatever it was out there. Get ready for the next story. If you haven't already, like and subscribe to continue listening to my stories, and enjoy. I've been working on this cruise ship for a while now, 2 years, maybe 3, but I've never really gotten used to the strange things that go on here. The passengers are always nice, and the staff is, well, they're mostly okay. But there's this one thing that gets talked about in whispers behind closed doors. You know, the kind of thing people brush off when someone walks into the room. It's a rumor, but it doesn't feel like one. It feels real. They call it Cabin 1404. No one ever talks about it directly, but if you know where to listen, you'll catch people muttering about it. Crew members joke about it, but you can tell they don't really think it's funny. You'd never find anyone willing to go near that place. Not on a dare, not for anything. I didn't care at first. I didn't believe in that kind of stuff. Ghosts, curses, that kind of thing. Nah. I was just a bartender. I didn't ask questions and I didn't care about rumors. But I should have known something was up the day I saw that couple walk in. They were all smiles, you know? Newlyweds. Freshly married, and looking like they were about to take on the world. I remember the bride. She was glowing, really, like the sun was shining through her hair. Her husband, he looked normal, nervous maybe, but then again, they're all nervous, right? I greeted them with my usual welcome aboard and asked if they wanted a drink, but I noticed the room key they had. 1404. It hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew that number. I'd seen it plenty of times before, but seeing it in their hands, it felt wrong. Something in me told me to say something, to warn them, but I didn't. I remember telling myself, it's just a number, it's just a number. But when I handed them the key, I could barely look them in the eye. She was all excited, asking about the ship's amenities and whatnot, but her husband, he kept glancing over his shoulder, his eyes flicking nervously toward the door like someone was watching him. He didn't say anything. He just kept smiling, but it wasn't right. It wasn't like the nervous, excited smiles of a honeymoon couple. It was the kind of smile someone puts on when they're trying to keep from freaking out. I wanted to tell him, but what could I say? That the cabin they were in was cursed? That no one who stayed there ever came back the same? That they might not come back at all? I couldn't. The thing is, the next few days I kept seeing them around the ship. They'd come to the bar, have a drink, laugh, but something was different about her, the bride. She didn't look like the same person anymore. She looked haunted. Her eyes were tired, like she hadn't slept in days, and she kept rubbing her arms like something was crawling under her skin. I heard her whisper to her husband one evening, something about the dreams. At first, I thought I misheard her. Dreams? What kind of dreams? I didn't ask. It was later that night when the husband came to the bar looking shaken that I got the first real clue. He didn't say much, just asked for a drink, but he looked like he hadn't slept in days either. I could see it in his eyes. Fear. Real fear. Like something was after him. When I asked him if everything was okay, he told me, real quiet. She's been having these nightmares every night, and they're not just nightmares. Not just nightmares, I asked, not really understanding what he meant. His face paled. She dreams about drowning, he said, staring into his drink. She wakes up gasping for air. She says something scratching her like claws on her skin. I don't know what to do. I didn't know what to say to that. I mean, it sounded insane, right? Claws? Drowning? I didn't want to freak him out more, so I just nodded, told him it was probably just stress from the wedding or something, that she'd be fine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't telling me everything. And the next day, it got worse. I was behind the bar when I heard him yelling. It wasn't just a shout, it was a panic, real and raw, and it made my stomach drop. I rushed out of the back and saw him running down the hall, shouting her name. I followed him, not sure what was going on, but by the time I caught up, they were gone. He was at the deck when I finally caught up to him. She was standing there, just standing at the edge of the ship, staring out at the ocean. It wasn't like she was looking at anything. She was just frozen, like she couldn't move. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, like she was in a trance. He shouted her name again, but it was like she didn't hear him. It was only when I got close enough that I heard it, the whispers. Faint, almost like a song. I'll never forget the look in her husband's eyes when he grabbed her. He wasn't just scared. He was terrified. He yanked her back from the edge, and I swear I saw something in the water, just a glimpse of something dark, like it was waiting. I don't know what I thought would happen after that night. Maybe I thought she'd get better, that it was just some kind of bad dream, or that whatever had its claws in her would let go. But I was wrong. The next few days felt heavier than usual. I could see the couple walking around the ship, but there was a distance between them now. The light in her eyes was gone, and the happy, nervous couple I'd seen at the start was now just two strangers, walking around like they were both carrying something terrible, like a weight that was pulling them under. The nightmares kept coming. She couldn't sleep. I saw her in the hallways, pacing in the middle of the night. She looked so tired, hollow. I overheard her mumbling to herself one night, but all she said was, "I'm going to drown. I have to drown." I tried to brush it off. It didn't make sense, but that look in her eyes, like she wasn't even there anymore, kept me awake at night. And then, one night, it happened again. I didn't know what time it was. Late. I was cleaning up the bar after the last few stragglers left. The lights were dim, the place quiet. But then I heard it. Faint at first, like a soft lullaby drifting through the air. It was the same eerie song I'd heard when she was on the deck. It was coming from somewhere. Close. My stomach turned. I ran out of the bar and rushed to her cabin. Her husband wasn't around, so I knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Nothing. My heart was racing now. What the hell was going on? I heard movement inside, and then the door creaked open just enough for me to see her standing there, staring at the floor. Her eyes were wide, glassy. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, voice hoarse, like she hadn't spoken in days. I couldn't get the words out. I was too scared. I could feel it. Something was wrong. Something was pulling at her. Something that wasn't human. She stepped back from the door, almost like she wanted me to follow her. Without thinking, I walked inside, the door shutting behind me with a soft thud. I'll never forget what happened next. Her husband burst into the room, shouting her name. His eyes were wild, panicked. "She's sleepwalking again," he yelled. But I could see it in his face. This wasn't just sleepwalking. This wasn't just a bad dream. "Please," he begged me, grabbing my arm. "You have to help me. She's been getting worse." I wanted to say something, anything to make him feel better, but I couldn't. The air in the room felt heavy. like something was pressing down on us. I watched as she turned and walked toward the door, her steps slow, deliberate. "She's going to the sea," he whispered, his voice shaking. And before I could stop her, she was moving down the hall, walking like she was being pulled by something unseen. I followed them, feeling sick to my stomach. The whispers grew louder the closer we got to the deck. I don't know how to explain it. It wasn't just the wind, it wasn't just the ship creaking. It was a voice, soft, seductive, calling her name, telling her to come to the edge. By the time we reached the deck, I could barely breathe. The night was cold, the air sharp. The sea stretched out before us, endless and dark, and there she was, standing at the edge of the ship, staring out at the water. Her eyes were vacant, like she was in a trance, like she couldn't hear us. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that the water looked different. It wasn't just the moonlight or the shadows playing tricks. There was something in the water, something moving. It felt alive. And I swear, if you looked hard enough, you could see it, just beneath the surface, waiting. Her husband ran up to her, grabbing her shoulders. "No, don't do it," he shouted, but she didn't respond. Her face was blank, like she wasn't even aware of him. And that's when it happened. She stepped forward, one slow, deliberate step. I don't know what I was thinking, but I ran forward, grabbing her wrist. Her skin was ice cold, and when I touched her, it was like she wasn't there. It was like my hand was passing through her. Her body jerked, like she was being pulled toward the water, and her feet slid forward as if she were weightless. I don't know how I managed to pull her back, but I did. The force holding her was like nothing I'd ever felt before. It was like something was dragging her toward the ocean, pulling her into the deep. Her nails dug into my arm, and she screamed, but it wasn't her voice. It was the sound of something ancient and drowning. I finally got her away from the edge, but not before she left marks on my skin. Her nails had scraped me, deep, jagged lines. But it wasn't just that. Her skin was marked too. When I looked at her arms, I saw the scratches. The same marks I'd seen in the stories, the ones that matched the symbols on the ancient shipwreck map. I could feel my heart stop. I didn't know what to do. The husband was crying, holding her close, but I didn't feel like I could help. The worst part? She didn't remember a thing. She just stared at me with those empty eyes like nothing had happened. She couldn't even explain what had driven her to the edge. I tried to talk to her the next day, but she wouldn't say a word. Her husband, though, he said something that chilled me to the bone. "She's gone," he whispered, his voice cracking. "She's gone, and I don't know how to get her back."